Yeah, sure.
Yeah,
So, uh,
yeah.
oh,
So
now.
now we're live. Exactly. Yeah, but regarding the chat, there is a really amazing audience for Rocket Lab Weekly, and they come exactly when we say that we're going to start. And some weeks they're like, "Where are you guys?"
Yeah, I
So
recognize your guys' names: Johnny, Francisco, Danny. Danny, I think, has more shares than me, so always a little jealous. Yeah.
awesome. So welcome, guys, to Rocket Lab Weekly. This is Thanksgiving weekend, and unfortunately, Matt couldn't make it. He's celebrating Thanksgiving with the family, but we have Dave here, who I'm equally as happy to have on the channel. And as
Thanks.
you are Canadian and I'm Swedish, we don't celebrate Thanksgiving at all. You guys celebrate it, as I heard from you, on the correct date, not as
Yes,
the
the
US.
correct.
Yeah.
The Americans have it mixed up. They have the wrong day.
Exactly. And we actually have a lot to talk about because there is a launch in something like 2 days from now. We just was arguing about it, that it's so hard with the New Zealand time because they're like ahead of us, I think. So it's like for us,
Yeah.
it's 2 days, but on the calendar, it's like on Tuesday, which is 3 days from now. But
Yeah, and
they have.
obviously, at least for me, it's super early in the morning. So, but I think I'm still going to try and watch this one because it's a little bit special, or at least it feels a bit special to return to launch and all that kind of thing. And they've made a few fixes. I was actually just watching an interview video yesterday from Peter Beck, and he mentioned that, talking about the fix they did make on the Electron and how it added maybe a couple kilograms of mass, because that was one of the things I was curious about. If they fixed the rocket and they put in this compartment, basically, like, is that impacting the performance? So it sounds pretty negligible, like 2 kilograms out of 320 or so.
Yeah, exactly. So, and then the happenings this week was that I added Rocket Lab shares to my portfolio. So now we start to become quite heavy hitters on this show because you
Yeah.
also have
Well, maybe you.
you also have quite some, no? You
Well, I mean, yeah, I about 11,000 shares now. I saw you already surpassed me, so good job on that. You're definitely putting your money where your mouth is, I guess, in terms of being a believer in Rocket Lab. So,
yeah,
congratulations on your new shares.
yeah, thank you. And it was very interesting because when you have not decided to buy yet, you look at the stock from a little bit of a different lens. And I was looking at it, before deciding to buy, that there is so much negativity that can happen. And I was like, okay, the price is 422, and I was like, I'm just going to wait. I think it's going to go down to 410. And his portfolio is together with my dad, and
Mm-hmm.
it's funny, like both of us got the idea at the same time, and we called each other, and I was like, shit, like the stock price is down at these levels because we had an Electron failure. Peter Beck was selling, and I'm
Yeah.
like, we're going back to launching it, because I was focused on like there's no good news coming, and there has been bad news. But I realized, like, we're going soon into a quarter of sorry, we're starting a year in 2024 where there will be 22 launches.
Mm-hmm.
Q1 is supposed to be the first quarter when they're shooting for over 100 million in revenue, and we're going back to launching Electrons. And suddenly I realized that the stock has a bigger chance of going back up than it is to go down.
Yeah.
So we
Yeah,
were like,
I think 2024 is looking like it's going to be a great year, to be honest with you. 22 launches, that's more than I was originally projecting. When I originally did my spreadsheet, I was thinking this was probably a couple years ago now. I was thinking maybe they'd get to like 19. So, I mean, that beats my forecast. And then obviously the return to launch coming up, and I'm sure we're going to see a lot more Neutron parts and testing things rolling off the line. Maybe some kind of a test launch at the end of 2024, but I wouldn't be disappointed if it falls to 2025, and continued growth on the space system side. So
yes. And I'm so curious about your viewpoint on space services, because I always get amazed, like, how much we talk about launching rockets, and actually Rocket Lab is only 33% a launch service company, and is actually a lot, like 2 times as big of a satellite or space services company.
Yeah.
And in almost every interview that you watch with Peter Beck, he's talking about the reason why you want to have the rockets and the space services is so that you can develop your space infrastructure. So it's like Rocket Lab is going to be a company where the launch services is going to be maybe 5% of the revenue, yet somehow like all the attention is on, also for me, but so my question to you is, when I was doing my modeling, I was like, okay, what is the growth number that I can assign to space services? And then I said, they must have given some kind of guidance. And I was looking back to their presentations, and earlier, I rewatched the Rocket Lab Investor Day, and they're so strategically silent about this part. And they are saying there's great demand. We're going for over 30% gross margin. So they're saying all the right things, but they're never giving any guidance. And did I miss
it? Was very, very difficult. Yeah. I redid my own valuation spreadsheet and made a video on that recently. And this was the hardest factor for me, at least. I kind of there's a few ways to think about it. So I was talking to one person on the Discord server, and he basically said, well, if you look at how fast the overall space industry is growing, we can at least assume that Rocket Lab is going to grow probably faster than that. So you take that number and then go higher than that by a bit. There have been some comments on like the ratio of revenue from launch to space systems. So right now it's like 2/3, 1/3. And I think they've said later on they see it, at least, once Neutron gets going over the medium term, it might be more like 50-50. So if you kind of map out what Neutron will make, maybe that'll give you an idea, but very difficult to have like any kind of certainty on the numbers for space systems.
So then the next question to you is, when I hear this, I almost want to put on my tinfoil hat, and I'm like, why would they conspire to not? Because like Rocket Lab is, like, how do you call it? Like, that is, from a financial aspect, more important to us investors than the actual launch services. And why would they? Is it their culture that they don't want to promise, or they want to sandbag, or they're uncertain, or we wouldn't believe if they would come out and
I mean, yeah, I can't read their mind. It's difficult. I think a lot of it is not wanting to miss estimates. They did very early on have some pretty aggressive targets for Electron cadence growth, and it didn't end up kind of going that way. And I feel like ever since then, they're very hesitant to like say any numbers firmly beyond a quarter or two out when they're like extremely confident. So yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, they have that new facility in Maryland opening up. They have, a Global Star. They'll be recognizing more revenue from it next year, as well as I think the reaction wheels. I think that's starting maybe next year as well, with the larger reaction wheels, the big contracts. So, but I just don't have the numbers, like anything firm from them. Yeah.
Okay.
I would love it if they would say 35% every year, we're going to grow space systems or something.
I mean, it's funny because logically it's a much easier business to scale than the launch business, because, if they just, at least that's what I would think, that if they get a huge order of satellites, let's say a mega constellation, and they have to produce 1,000 satellites of the same type, right?
Yeah.
Then it should be an easier one to scale than the rockets themselves. But out of curiosity, I calculated with a 25% growth rate on space services. What did you calculate with?
Yeah, so I thought next year might be a little more, and I said like 30. And then I kind of want to play it safe, and if I'm surprised, I want to be pleasantly surprised and not disappointed. So I also said 25% going forward. Let's just say 25 and see how the numbers turn out if it is 25. But it wouldn't surprise me if it's more, especially Yeah, especially if they want to keep the same ratio for like launch and space systems, because we know they're putting so much money into Neutron, and it should in 5-6 years it should be bringing in quite a lot. So
Okay, cool. So at least then we are in the same ballpark. It's not
yeah,
that I'm overly optimistic and you're, yeah, we're in the same, or maybe we're both wrong. We
we
don't
could
know.
both be wrong. Yeah,
Yeah,
I was talking
exactly.
to someone else. They said that they just modeled it 30% annual growth, and that seemed pretty reasonable to me as well. So
Yeah, yeah. Okay, cool. So now I want to address something that basically when I announced that I'm buying shares of Rocket Lab, I have gotten, like some I can't speak. So some comments that were
yeah,
congratulating.
congratulatory.
Exactly, that was the word. And some that was bringing up very interesting fear points of Rocket Lab that I want to address with you and maybe ask these questions.
Sure.
So one of them was that they just had a launch failure. And basically, some people were suggesting that because they had this launch failure, who would ever fly on them? Because the Falcon 9 is so good and, SpaceX takes all this space. And
Yeah.
I know you did a video on this on your channel. By the way, the link to your channel is in the description if people want to check it out. So what is, when you compare the two rockets, can you tell us a little bit about this?
Okay. Sorry, I just got distracted looking at chat. I apologize. So it was, what was the question again?
So it was that there has been some negativity about
Oh yeah.
Electron being unreliable, and how
Mhm.
does it compare?
Yeah, so I made a video a while back, basically looking into, how many years Electron has been operational, and then I went to that point with Falcon 9. So I don't remember the exact number, but let's say Electron's been operational for 6 or 7 years. I went the first 6 or 7 years of Falcon 9 and counted the failures of each rocket, and I didn't include those, attempted landings, but just the failure for the payload getting to its proper orbit, and it was very similar. Some people complained because the very first Electron launch, it actually wasn't their fault that it failed. It was kind of I believe it was like a regulatory body overseeing it triggered the flight termination. But the rocket was actually performing properly, so I didn't count that failure, and some people thought I should have. So depending on how you count it, they had an even number of failures through their first, 5+ years of service, or maybe Electron had one more, but still very close. And I think this was just such a weird failure we just had. And I don't know if you listened to the explanation from Peter. He talked about it a few times. A lot of things had to happen for this failure to occur. And to me, it was just like a freak accident. And I don't think it really shows Electron not being reliable.
I was, by the way, so impressed with how he took his time on the investor call and explained it in a way that non-space nerds could understand it. And even if you didn't understand everything, you understood that it was a super freak. Like it
Yeah.
was like yeah.
Yeah,
If you
very
would
interesting.
look at
I love the fact that he's so knowledgeable technically. I was thinking of making a video on this topic. Like, I feel like companies, space companies, and even other companies where the CEO is more of like a businessman and not like a technically knowledgeable person tend to do less well. At least it seems like that to me. Like even Palantir, like Alex Karp, from what I understand, is a very like smart guy, not just on the business side, but the programming and all that stuff. So yeah.
yeah. Okay, and then the second thing that was coming up from people, and actually goes with what Johnny Mac is asking, because he's asking in the comments, I don't understand why so much of retail community seems hesitant to embrace Rocket Lab as opposed to other growth companies. Rocket Lab just seems so promising and makes me wonder what I'm seeing and what they're not seeing. And so the questions that I get on this is always like, yeah, but why would you invest in this space if like SpaceX is already there and they're like winning everything, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, we can. I want to hear your viewpoint on this, and then
Sure.
yeah.
I mean, I think it's not being embraced as fully as some other companies for like a few reasons. I don't think it's the profitability point of view, like someone was saying in the chat, because partly that, but like people were investing in probably Palantir and I know for sure Tesla before they became profitable. And that was actually a big catalyst for, stock growth was when they became profitable. But I think a lot of it is they are in some senses competing with Elon Musk and SpaceX. And a lot of people made their money off of Tesla out there. And now to invest in a company that may in some ways be competing with him would be scary and they don't want to do it. And everyone is very excited about Starship and they watch that and they just assume, well, if Starship is going to operate, then that's it for the entire space industry, which I don't think is the case. But yeah, very scared to bet on anyone, I guess, other than SpaceX and the space industry, I think, right now.
Yeah, and I think that here it's also, when the investors take like a very quick look and they make up their mind without doing due diligence, I can understand how they come to this viewpoint, right? But first of all, Rocket Lab is 33% the rocket launch only. So 66% is not even competing with SpaceX because SpaceX doesn't manufacture satellites. And then the 33%, which you could say is competing with SpaceX, is like in an adjacent field because like SpaceX abandoned the Falcon 1, which would have been the small launch provider. And as far as I understand, when they develop Starship, they're going to abandon the Falcon 9. And I'm curious about here what you think, because I think that the Starship is going to open up like new applications to space, and then they should be busy with that. What I mean is, how like JWST had to be like wrapped into a rocket because there wasn't like a big enough rocket that
the fairing,
and it made the mission like super risky, and that's why it cost like 20 billion to launch. And I actually checked the specs, and like JWST would fit into Starship like fully opened with margin space, so we can either send many JWSTs or we can design much bigger telescopes that you fold and like into the Starships. And I think they will go into they will create a new market, and then Neutron is going to compete. I don't think they will be adjacent to each other. That's my point.
Sure. Yeah, I would say, well, Rocket Lab has said straight out that Neutron is designed to be able to compete with Falcon 9. So you're right about, Elon has said previously, and I don't know how aspirational this is because obviously he's been way off on some timelines and stuff like that, saying like FSD was supposed to be done 3 years ago and all that kind of stuff. But he said he thinks he can get Starship to launch cheaper than Falcon 9. So once that happens, there's no point in launching a Falcon 9. You just launch the Starship. We'll see how that shapes up, how long that takes to, if it does come to fruition. If not, if they do cancel it, then yeah, Rocket Lab's Neutron would be in a very good position for vehicles of that size. And Starship. I mean, there's so many interesting, and this is why I do say like I'm not anti SpaceX, even though I'm pro Rocket Lab. There's a lot of potential really cool things that Starship will enable, and those telescopes you're talking about were one of them, and so many more potential applications out there, just bringing a ton of mass up from the Earth. But exactly. In terms of like, the medium to heavy lift section, I think Neutron would compete favorably with Falcon 9 in a lot of cases. And I'm just not entirely sure how the organization of multiple payloads into a Starship would work. Like if you have one satellite that fits into a Neutron, are they going to fill up a Starship with tons of other stuff and send them all to like a similar orbit, or are they just I don't know how that'll all play out, but I think there's room for both for sure, especially because not everyone wants to launch on SpaceX, especially if they compete with them, and there's a lot of people looking to compete with them. So
and I was actually looking at the numbers. I want to see if I can share something. Maybe I didn't save it. No, I didn't say it, but it's also a bit misleading because people talk about kilograms to space, and then they think that okay, the Falcon 9 is $3,000 per kilogram to space, and Neutron is going to be 3,500 kilograms to space. So automatically everything is cheaper on the Falcon 9. But what they don't take into consideration is that the Falcon 9 launch, the last data that I found on it is $67 million per launch.
Yeah.
And the Neutron they're aiming to be $50 million per launch, right? And then if you have a satellite that fits into, or a payload that fits into both rockets, it's going to be cheaper to launch it on the Neutron because it's just, even though that the per kilogram of the rocket is more expensive than the Falcon 9, right? And then if you have a payload that doesn't fit in the Neutron but fits in the Falcon 9, then it's always going to be cheaper on the Falcon 9. And yes, your kilogram price would be more favorable. But I think that people don't get this somehow.
Yeah, and it's a metric I've used before previously, just because like it's so easy when you're trying to compare rockets. It's like the easiest go-to for price. But I mean, even Peter Beck and lots of people have said like this price per kilogram metric does not really make the most sense, and it doesn't necessarily lead to what's the cheapest to launch your satellite. That was a perfect example with the Neutron. Like if it fits on a Neutron, you send it on a Neutron. If it fits on a Falcon 9, you send it on that. So yeah, I think we need to evolve in our thinking of like what's cheaper, because it's more than just price per kilogram, which is, everyone, when you talk about Starship, they're like the price per kilogram will be this, but there's more to it than that.
Yeah, exactly, because I think very easily the Starship can have the problem that Elon over PR'd it, because you remember in interviews, Peter Beck always says that, yeah, Elon says that the fuel cost will be like $2 million. And then Peter Beck is like, yeah, but you don't only have fuel cost, you have the launch pad, you have all the infrastructure, the people around it.
Yeah.
And I think very easily you can have this problem with Starship that, yes, if you're trying to launch 20 tons to space, it will be unbeatable because it's so cheap. But if you're trying to launch something that fits onto a Neutron, then the Neutron will always be cheaper. So it will, yeah. My
exactly.
prediction
And
is,
like let's say you have a 5-ton satellite, and Starship is doing 100 tons. Are they really gonna? And by the way, it's the cadence that really drives down the cost and amortizes all those ground infrastructure costs across a ton of launches. So like, how many launches of Starship do you fill up with tons of satellites that are like 5 tons, 3 tons, whatever? It'll be very interesting to see how this market shapes up. Nothing really like it has happened before, I would say.
Yeah, and I think also another thing, because back to this topic of like what Wall Street misses and what do they see that we don't see, and what do we see that they don't see. And another thing is, I think people don't understand how much of a moat it is that you can launch rockets. It's like almost like a wall of fire where you have. I was also Googling it before the show. There is over 100 startups that are trying to launch rockets, and there is 5 companies who are able to launch rockets. It's ULA, SpaceX, not even Blue Origin, like able to. And ULA is basically being sold because they don't have this reusable concept. And that's also something that I think is not being able to, or not being taken into consideration, how much of a freaking moat it is that you can go to space.
Yeah, I mean, it's important for sure. I mean, I've heard it said in so many interviews. I think it's true. Like the space companies of the future, they'll launch their own satellites, they'll offer them, they'll provide services. So it's why Starlink is so hard to compete with. And Neutron, basically Falcon 9 is what enabled Starlink, and Neutron could enable other constellations like that. So all these other companies, they're in for a rough time, because it's very hard. Like, obviously they always start small because they don't have the money to start with a big rocket, but the smallest rocket is the hardest to make like economically viable. So it's extremely challenging for them.
Yeah, yeah. So back to this point of don't bet against Elon. Like I think none of us are talking bad about SpaceX, and I think that there's more than enough room in this space for both companies to thrive. And
yeah, sorry, I was just going to say, yeah, I think that sentiment is a lot of why there's not a ton of retail. And well, there is some, to be fair. Some retail investors are excited about Rocket Lab, but perhaps not as much as they're afraid about betting against Elon. And yeah, like as I've said, I'm kind of betting for both SpaceX and Rocket Lab is how I want SpaceX to succeed because like Starship is going to enable some super cool stuff for the future. And I want to see humans land on the moon again in 2035 or whenever it happens.
Yeah. And also, there's valuation also. Like, honestly, if SpaceX, unfortunately, is not public, right? But let's say it was public. I just read in the news that they're planning to do another funding round at 150 billion in valuation.
Yeah.
Like, how much of an upside is left in that company? So, like, even if you could invest in SpaceX, like which one is the better opportunity? Because I think definitely SpaceX is a fantastic company. They're for sure going to be around. But Rocket Lab is valued at 2 billion, which is ridiculously low, I think, compared to.
Yeah, I'd say Rocket Lab is a pretty good, value right now. I mean, my cost basis is above where it is right now. So yeah, for sure, I would add more. SpaceX it'd be tough. Like I'd need more data on the projections of how much revenue they think they'll bring in the future for Starlink and all the rest. But then you also have this factor where Elon, I believe he's 100% serious about wanting to drive, human colony on Mars. And that will not be a money-making venture for a very long time. So that makes it a little difficult as an investor, like, money's the bottom line. So Starlink's going to be a cash cow. He's kind of said before the reason for Starlink is to fund their efforts to get to Mars. And I cheer him on as a space fan, but as an investor, it would be tough. Like, okay, how many billions are we spending on trying to set up a colony on Mars, and what's the return on that investment?
Yeah, it's philanthropy.
And sorry, Blake mentioned, they do plan on IPOing Starlink, but probably not 100% of it. From what I understand, they would at least retain some ownership of it.
Yeah. Okay, and then another comment about Rocket Lab, which is very frequent, and I also think it's very misunderstood, is they're super risky because rockets can blow up. And my comment on this is, I think it's fantastic for us that rockets blow up because the share price goes down, but nothing actually changes with the manifest, because it's not that they get less launches. It's that so it's not that they're losing customers. It's just the production, instead of doing it over 6 quarters, they will do the same amount of production in 5 quarters. And because the Electron is so mature at this point, like they have had, I don't know, 40 plus missions. So any of the mistakes that come up now, they're like easy. It's not like Astra, where it's like every second launch is a failure.
More than that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like right now, I feel very comfortable with Electron, and I'm not too worried about more failures, even though we just had one recently, funny enough. But, it's a part of the process. There is insurance for these launches. So when something does go wrong, there's insurance for these companies. But their insurance fees could go up if a rocket looks unreliable, and maybe in the future less customers. But there's been no sign of customers avoiding Electron because of reliability. So they have a good track record.
Yeah, exactly. We have a question from the audience here. Can you speak a little bit about the expected upcoming launch demand supply gap in 2026, 2027 that Peter talks about often? What's driving the demand side?
Yeah, so a few things. He's mostly, when he talks about that, he's not talking about small launch. He's talking about the larger constellations. So number one, is Amazon's Kuiper constellation, which is planned to be huge, like the competitor to Starlink, and they're not launching SpaceX. So they've given contracts out to 3 vehicles, and all of them have been significantly delayed, and they were supposed to be launching years ago. None of them are. Amazon's under a deadline from the regulators where they have to get half of their constellation up by a certain date. And if they don't, then they lose approval to launch those remaining satellites. So Amazon's a big one who will need a lot of launch. Then we have the NSSL program, phase 3, opening up like 2025-ish, which is basically all the government defense launches, and everyone competes for that at the same time. These phases come along like once every 10 years or something like that, and there's like 90 plus launches in this phase. So they're like, everyone wants in on this NSSL phase 3. And Peter Beck's already said they kind of plan Neutron with that in mind as well, and it's going to come online around the time when they can bid it on some of these launches. And there's even more and more constellations people want for communications and Earth observation and all the rest.
Exactly. I was researching this very topic a little bit before the video, and I found this chart, which is from McKinsey.com. I believe they're a consulting company, and they have done projections for the space industry. And this mega constellations that basically Starlink started is a new thing, or a newer thing. It's since the advent of the private space era, and I think that is because when you launch these mega constellations, they are going into low Earth orbit, and they deorbit a lot faster than the geostationary orbit ones. Like those ones orbit for like 20-30 years, and I think that they get killed because the battery runs out. It's not even that they deorbit, but in low Earth orbit you still have a little bit of atmospheric drag, and I think it takes like 5-6 years for the satellite to deorbit. So that means that if you have a mega constellation that is 15,000 satellites, then each year you need to replace like 20% of that, which is what, like 3,000 satellites, right? And if they're going up, I mean, they're not going, so it's not like 3,000 Electron launches. It's probably going to go into Neutron, where they're shooting up, I don't know, 100, 150 of them at the same time. It's still 30 launches of neutrons just for one mega constellation. And I mean, Starlink, we know who's servicing that. But yeah.
Yeah, no, I've just heard comments, people who go to space conferences and stuff and talking about the future of the industry. And they say like no one's talking about they want to launch a satellite anymore. Everyone's talking about I want to launch a constellation of satellites, which is like potentially hundreds. So there's a lot of constellations people want to put up there.
Yeah, exactly. And Rocket Lab is one that is actively investigating what space infrastructure they can put out there, which I think is kind of a weird thing, because when you're in business, it can be like a backstab of, because like basically what happened to SpaceX is they were launching like satellites, and then I think they were launching like this OneWeb internet constellation, and somebody at SpaceX went like, wait a minute, it's like we could do it for this price and this price, and oh my god, this is a money-making machine. And then they end up like taking a customer's business or competing with the customer,
Yeah.
And one of the items on this list is space startups here. And it says that in 2022 we had less than 600 space startups, and in 2030 we are going to have over 1,000. And these are not going to be launch providers. These are going to be, I don't know, different kind of space applications, like space manufacturing, Earth imaging, I don't know. And then you're going to have to launch with like Rocket Lab, knowing that they're trying to scout out like what is the best business opportunity to do. It's kind of dangerous, or I don't
Yeah,
know.
I
But
mean, maybe that's one reason why they don't want to come out and say what they're thinking of doing, because then a potential customer might not want to work with them. But I think it is the right move down the line. It's just the recurring revenue is too attractive to just stick with launching other people's satellites and building them for them. So
yeah,
yeah.
and I mean, look, business is business, and this is when you see what Peter Beck said, that when you can launch rockets, you have the keys to space, and it's such a big moat that you can technically put any of these startups out of business, because if their business is too good, then you just copy what they're doing, and then
Yeah.
yeah.
It's interesting, like, because SpaceX launches a lot of their own competitors right now, and they probably didn't have to do that. Like, I'm sure they don't want to get accused of trying to have a monopoly or getting a monopoly. But like, don't think there's anything saying SpaceX had to launch OneWeb or some of these other
No, no,
players. So
no. I mean, they were just the best option, I guess.
right, but if they wanted their own service, they could refuse to launch these other people, and then these other startups would be in a lot of trouble.
Yeah, yeah.
Anyway.
It's a very interesting topic. And I so wish that there was more data, because, okay, another question. So do you model the space infrastructure, or is it just like a pure bonus in your, like, if it and when it happens, it's just a pure bonus
Yeah,
to the
no, I
valuation?
didn't. I don't know how to do that. It'd be very difficult. We don't have any numbers or any forecasts. The interesting thing is when it starts, it's probably negative at first for the numbers, because you're not getting paid for those launches. You're not getting paid right away to build satellites. You build your satellites, you launch them, they get into orbit, and only over time you start accruing that revenue. So it'd be like a short-term hit for a very long-term like gain.
But like, if yes, cash flow wise, but don't
Yeah.
you think that the stock would react super positive on
Oh
it?
yeah, for sure, probably. Um, we just don't have any information really, so it's so
Yeah.
difficult. Like we don't know what the kind of constellation they'll do. Like, yeah, it's tough. I don't think they'll try
Yeah.
to go head to head with Starlink.
No, 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 no. I'm also sure, and I don't think that it's going to be Earth imaging, because there's so many startups, and I just don't think it's that good of a business.
Yeah, and they don't talk very much about Earth imaging. You do hear them say they're very strategic about what contracts they accept. So then I start looking at what satellites they're building for who and what those satellites are doing to see if that gives you any clues. And it's interesting to dive down that rabbit hole.
Yeah, yeah. I just wanted to show the viewers another chart that I found, which was very, very interesting to me, and it again shows to this that Rocket Lab is, like, we think, I guess you and me, that they're undervalued for their launch service and the space systems. And then we know that there is the space infrastructure that is coming, that is basically, like, you can look at it as a call option or a bonus on the stock.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people think about Rocket Lab as only a rocket company, right? And this is a diagram of the space industry in 2018, and you can see it's a $344 billion industry, and the launch services of it is 5.5 billion. It's like less than 2% of the total space economy is only the launch, and yet this is, as we spoke about it, it's the keys to space. Like, without that, you don't get any of the other ones.
Mm-hmm.
And it has a huge moat around it. And then you have right next to it, the satellite manufacturing, which is like a TAM of 3 times as much, and it's almost exactly the revenue of Rocket Lab. Like 1/3 launch and 2/3 satellite and space systems.
Mm-hmm.
And all the rest is would be the space services, what Peter Beck talks about all the time. And it's just very, very interesting to me how, like, everyone's focused on launch, and it's like 2% of the space economy.
It's just the most exciting part. It's fun.
Yeah,
There's
yeah, definitely.
explosions, but Yeah, the bottom line is the cash flow and the money, so that's what'll drive the stock in the future. But yeah, the rocket will unlock all that, so it is important.
Yeah. And again, such few companies have gone past that point. So it becomes an almost insurmountable moat, you know? And there's so many space startups that are not even, I mean, they're just.
Yeah, and many aren't trying, to be fair. Like, not everyone's trying to build their own rocket. So it'll be interesting, I think, as well, to see how those companies do in the future. So the likes of a Planet Labs, or there's so many others that are building satellites and doing interesting things. How will they compete in the future when they don't have launch, but then you have both SpaceX, Rocket Lab, and maybe some others with both launch and their own in-house satellite manufacturing doing everything?
This is when you have this like cynical viewpoint that, like, if their business is like an okay business, but it's not an outstanding business, then they will not get competed on, right? Like, then SpaceX and Rocket Lab will not go into it. So that's what makes it safe. But if Planet Labs business would be like an unbelievably profitable, then SpaceX would already be in it, I think.
It's interesting. I think Earth observation, there's a bunch of companies going for it right now. You got Planet Labs, Black Sky, Spire, a bunch of others, but it's still pretty small compared to like communications, and communications is a huge umbrella. But definitely a lot more in that space.
Yes. By the way, Astra, what are your thoughts about this company? I'm surprised every day they're alive.
Yeah, no, there's no way they survive as a public company anymore. It's just not possible, I don't think. There was an offer made by Chris Kemp and Dr. I forget his name, but he was like one of the co-founders of the company. They offered like $30 million to take it private or something like that, which is not a lot, but it was actually more than the company was valued at, which I found kind of interesting, because like their facilities and equipment must be worth way more than 30 million, but everyone's valuing them for bankruptcy at this point, and I would too. So the only way they survive is if they go private, someone pumps in a bunch of money, because they're nowhere near being profitable or making money, and they've got no cash left. They've taken out a couple loans to like kind of extend their life, but you got to pay those back with interest. So
and this week, I think the latest announcement was that they got a $2.7 million loan, which I don't even know
you like
what
a week maybe, like, and then you got to pay that back with interest, and you're not making any money. Like, I don't know what you do. It's
and then my question is, if they take the company private, then what? So let's say that Mark Kemp pays 30 million, I don't know from where, then they still need, I think, hundreds of millions to.
They need to find investors on the private markets willing to give them money, because it won't happen on the public markets. And the stock price being this low, like, is like a self-fulfilling prophecy of like you can't do anything with when your stock price is that low. So they would need to go private, and they would need to have rich friends who are willing to give them cash. So the fact that they're making this offer, maybe they do. Maybe they think they can get some more cash and survive, or someone else completely different buys them, or they just go out of business, because they can't continue to exist on the public stock markets. I don't see. They even delayed their earnings call recently, I think.
And then they canceled it 100%, and then they just came out with the press release about their, and I don't even think they released their numbers. It was just like, we had a revenue this, and you if you want to see it, it's on their website, I believe.
Yeah, bizarre. That's never a good sign when a public company either misses their earnings call, cancels it completely even. So
and segueing from them needing to raise money to, do you think that Rocket Lab will need to raise money? Because I saw you made a video about why they should even raise money currently at the moment.
I think they do. and that's not necessarily a bad thing. Like, space is an expensive business. Um, they have a decent chunk of change on the balance sheet, but I think all the spending on Neutron, um, I would say, like, maybe there's a chance they are able to get through without raising money, but I think if it starts to even look a little bit close, the stock gets hit hard, and when it gets hit hard, then it
It's
becomes
much
harder to
worse.
raise money. So, and that's like the thing I was saying about how the stock price being low is like causes damage of its own. So if it's already high, maybe we get a little bump at some point. Um, I think raising some money just kind of removes any risk. Like, it is a rocket. Rockets, if Neutron has some problems and we get an explosion or two, uh, it would just give us the safety net, I think. What do you think?
Yeah, when I was listening to the conference call, I don't know if you caught that part. They asked, I think one analyst asked about their cash burn and how they think about the finances, and then the CFO, it was how he answered the question. It was so interesting because he didn't say that we're like the money is enough to make us cash flow positive.
Yeah.
He said that we are very confident that the money is enough for what we said we were going to do, which is to put Neutron on the pad and like something else. And he didn't say the money is enough to make us cash flow positive, right?
I did catch that myself and found it interesting because I think, and it's telling, right? The language has gradually been softening a little bit. I think a while back it was like the money we raised from our SPAC is enough forever to get profitable, to like it's enough to launch Neutron to whatever. And the first launch of Neutron will not have a payload because it'll be like a test launch. So that won't bring in any revenue. So yeah, saying we have enough to launch Neutron doesn't mean we have enough to reach profitability for sure.
Yeah, but maybe they're strategically, because like Peter Beck talked about on the earnings call, that he's not willing to sell Neutron until the customers are willing to pay the real price for it, because he thinks it destroys, like he's seen it with Electron, that it destroys the business model for years to come. And I got this idea, like, what if also like raising money, they would want to like fly Neutron, and then they have a successful flight with Neutron, and then probably the stock price would anyways go up, and then use that to raise money.
Yeah, I was thinking, obviously you want to be opportunistic, and you don't want to do it below a certain level. Like, ideally, if they're raising money, they want to do it at a valuation that's like relatively high.
You got muted, Dave. You got muted. I don't know what happened. No, now you're.
I have no idea what happened there.
Yeah.
You guys missed all that, eh?
Yeah. So if you could give it again.
Yeah, I don't know. I was just saying, you probably, I would not be thrilled if they did it where the price is today, but I think they would want to raise capital at a valuation a little higher, and maybe when one of those catalysts comes along, they can be opportunistic about it, is the way to do it. And the funny thing is, you don't want to tell people beforehand, because if you tell people you're going to do it, sometimes that causes a drop, and therefore you get more dilution. So it's actually better for your shareholders to basically lie to them and say, we're not going to raise capital. But yeah.
It's so tricky, because Tesla had this that they announced like a capital raise in 2018 or something, and then the stock rallied after, because it was like taking out bankruptcy fears, and
Yeah.
But I guess that was like in 1 in 100, because
I guess it depends on the scenario. Yeah, I've seen a lot where when companies announce dilution, the stock price drops. So
yeah, that's the normal, like
yeah.
That's what I mean. Like Tesla was 1 in 100.
But even in that
what
Tesla situation, because I was invested back then, Elon was going on saying, we won't need to raise money. We won't need to raise money. And then one day it's like, okay, we're raising money. So
yeah. It's true. I guess you have to do it that way. And it's, it's also that you have different options, because you can also take loans in the business.
yeah.
So I guess if the stock price is horribly low, then you can take a loan, which is a bigger risk somehow for the shareholders. But if you manage to pay back the loan, then in the end it's a much better solution than diluting us.
Yeah, they do actually currently have a loan, but yeah, so they could do more.
Yeah, exactly. Cool. I think that you have to go very soon. So
yeah.
I think that this is a good point to end. Thank you so much for coming on the show. It was a pleasure.
No problem.
And hope you can come more often.
Sure. Yeah, it's always fun talking to you about this stuff. Time flies. I didn't even realize what time it was. So, yeah. Thanks for everyone who joined us and participated in the chat as well.
Yeah. Thank you, guys. See you next week. All right.
All right.
Ciao,
See ya.
ciao.